Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Israel has reportedly carried out military strikes in Iraq. U.S. officials tell the New York Times that Israel bombed a weapons depot that was allegedly being used by Iran to move weapons to Syria. This will be the first time Israel has bombed Iraq in nearly 4 decades, and a major escalation of Israel's campaign against Iran. AbuKhalil is a professor of political science at California State University. Welcome, Professor AbuKhalil. Your reaction to this news?
Well, Aaron, it's really not surprising. I mean, I am old enough, I'm 59 years old. In my own lifetime, Israel has bombed Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and it has also downed a Libyan civilian airliner. So the story of Israeli covert and overt destruction and terrorism in the Middle East region is a very old story. The only surprising thing about it is that how little coverage it gets here in the United States. I mean, this is the 4th or 5th time Israel has bombed targets inside Iraq, and the American media treats it with such disregard or yawn even. And I think what is also shameful is that the Iraqi sectarian government, which is still beholden to the American occupation, I mean, American occupiers in Iraq are still roaming the place, bombing and flying, without any knowledge of the Iraqi government. Even today, the Iraqi government admits that America flies in Iraq without notification to the Iraqi government. And it is also beholden to the Shiite sectarian religious leadership, particularly to the Ayatollah Sistani, who I call the cleric of occupation, who is busy banning chess game without worrying about this violation, blatant violation of Iraqi sovereignty, first by the Americans, from the occupation until later, until today, or now with the Israelis. And what is shameful is that even those targeted, like Al-Hashd, have been very quiet about what has happened, the outrage of bombing Iraq. The Iraqi government, however, is now saying it is still under review. They have appointed a special commission to determine who is responsible for these bombings. I mean, Israel basically concedes that they are behind it, and yet the Iraqi government insists that Israel is innocent until proven guilty. Maybe they will find that Indonesia was behind the bombing, for all we know.
Now, some U.S. officials were anonymously suggesting that Israel might have gone too far here, that they were unnerved or uncomfortable with Israel's strike on Iraq. Do you believe them? Do you believe that there might be some U.S. opposition to what Israel has done here? Or do you think that this could not have happened without the U.S. green light?
No, I do believe it. And I only believe it because America is not concerned about Iraq or its sovereignty for all. I mean, of course not. They are worried about the plight of the American occupation force, both in Syria and Iraq, because they know if retaliation occurs and if this escalates, they could easily be targets by these same forces. So no, I think there's genuine concern about that. And of course, Israel is the last country in the world to ever worry about repercussions or impact of its own actions and violence on anybody, whether Americans or otherwise.
Israel has now carried out hundreds of strikes in Syria going back to 2011.
100, yeah.
And when the media in the U.S. reports on those strikes, they're often portrayed as an effort to push back on Iran, to prevent Iran from threatening Israel's sovereignty. That has been repeated pretty much as an article of religious faith here in the U.S., not just in the media, but also by U.S. politicians. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I can tell you in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Arab side only started one war, 1973. Every other war, every aggression, every invasion was initiated by the state of Israel. And yet, American media continues, and of course, the two parties in power continue to provide Israel with excuses and justification for all its violence and action. I think that, Israeli actions and bombings inside Syria and Iraq are treated as if they are part and the requirement of maintaining peace and stability in the Middle East, while in reality, there is no source of instability and chaos and violence in the region and terrorism more than by the state of Israel, by far.
And it's funny, you mentioned the only time the Arab side starting a war against Israel being 73, but of course, what did they attack then? They attacked land that Israel had occupied and taken from them in 67.
And the war came in 73 after years of begging by the Arab government, begging the Israeli government to withdraw from these territories that occupied in 1967, but they didn't. And of course, the war was also very limited. I mean, it only lasted for 2 days. And then the Egyptian dictator, Anwar Sadat, who's a great darling of US media by both parties as well, started to notify the Americans and the Israelis that he really didn't want to push any farther. He just wanted a peaceful settlement. And that was arranged. And that what resulted in a war that was eventually victorious for the Arab side to end with a victory for the Israelis.
So finally, what would the Israeli motive be, do you think, to bomb a site in Iraq? It claims that that is this Iranian depot or this weapons depot was used by Iran to move weapons to Syria. What do you think would be its actual motive to take an extraordinary act like bombing Iraq, a official U.S. ally?
Well, the thing is about the story of defeating ISIS, Aaron, is that the people who really defeated ISIS are the unacknowledged soldiers in Western media. I mean, if you believe American media, basically, it was 2,000 U.S. soldiers in Syria who really defeated ISIS, or it was a militia that was equipped and trained by the U.S. who defeated ISIS. The people who defeated ISIS in Syria and Iraq were the foes of the United States. I mean, it's a fact. It's not a pleasant fact for the media to concede, but that's the reality. These are the Hashid militias inside Iraq, because the Iraqi army, which was created by the American occupier, did miserably. It fell within a few days before the advances of ISIS. And in Syria, it was the foes of the United States who largely defeated ISIS. So the natives were the one who did the actual fighting and dying in the war against ISIS, even though America and American Western correspondents would like to give the credit only to the 2,000 US soldiers. Israelis are worried and scared because Israel has a situation in Lebanon. Hezbollah came out of the fighting against Israeli occupation of Lebanon in 1982. And Hezbollah now terrifies Israel. Here is a party of volunteers, which people in the United States hate and classify as terrorism, but it also humiliated Israel on the battlefield in a way that has never been experienced by Israel in any battlefield. And Israel is also terrified that maybe these militias in southern Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen are going to become formidable enemies of the state of Israel. And Israel treats the entire region as its own backyard. Israel does not recognize borders of any country in the region except its own unrecognized borders. And for that reason, it doesn't want the power and the fighting force of the Hashid to become in any way threatening in a future conflict against the state of Israel and its occupation.
All right. AbuKhalil, professor of political science at California State University. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.